Hello, my name is Lindsay Christensen, and I've been a dealer in unusual books for several decades now. My business, Christensen Rare Books, is a member of the Independent Online Booksellers Association. Today, I'd like to share with you something very special. Down through the years, I've handled many very interesting items. A few include Carter's The Tomb of Tutankhamun, the first edition in 3 volumes, books signed by Arthur Rackham, George Bernard Shaw, Evelyn Waugh, W.G. Grace, color plate books like Sowerby's British Mineralogy and David Roberts' The Holy Land, some very interesting manuscripts, an example being a 1913 letter by Roger Casement expressing strong views on Irish language and independence just 3 years before his execution for treason. But I've always been particularly excited by books and ephemera produced in obscure localities, ideally with a very limited print run. For example, mission imprints. It fascinates me that in the heat or in the cold of a tropical or a polar outpost, it's possible to conceive something that's not merely concerned with survival, but something reflecting our better selves. If civilization with its products like books flourishes in prosperity and is worth celebrating, then surely there's even greater reason to marvel at printed works from the battlefront, from an unmapped corner of the wilderness, from a moment when hope seems to be ebbing. A place that certainly qualifies as an obscure locality is Tristan da Cunha, often called the loneliest island in the world, and it certainly is the most isolated inhabited island. Population of fewer than 300 people lives there in the South Atlantic, 2,400 kilometers from St. Helena, 2,800 kilometers from South Africa, 3,700 kilometers from South America. The island was discovered in 1506 by the navigator Tristan da Cunha and formally annexed and settled by the British in 1816. You'll remember that Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena following Waterloo in 1815, and it was feared that the French might use Tristan as a launching post for a rescue of the emperor. The village of Edinburgh of the Seven Seas is the one settlement on the island, and it's inhabited by families descended from the early settlers. The economy is largely based on the rock lobster fishery. The sale of postage stamps earns something. The arable land is communally owned. Families farm their allotments. Pre-currency days, there was a barter economy, until quite recently, in fact. The natural history of Tristan and its neighboring islands of Nightingale and Inaccessible is part of the appeal of this very, very isolated spot. Marine life is conserved in the marine protection zone. No fishing is allowed apart from what's associated with the lobster fishery. Pelagic birds and rockhopper penguins breed on the island group, and the Tristan thrush, endemic to the islands, is a noteworthy land bird. Alan Crawford, a meteorologist and engineer, was connected with the island from 1937 when he was a member of a Norwegian scientific expedition, but he returned in 1942 when he was posted as a member of the Royal Naval Radio and Meteorological Station. His association with Tristan continued, and in 1961 there was a volcanic eruption resulting in the evacuation of the islanders to the UK. But they pined for their lonely, peaceful home. And in 1963, Alan Crawford played a key role in the return of the islanders to their home after many pleas he received from them to facilitate their homecoming. I'd like to urge you to look out for a BBC Witness History podcast entitled The Remote Island That Was Evacuated to 10,000 Kilometers Away. it includes a wonderful 1961 interview with the islander Mary Swain, and if you listen, you'll get a taste of her unique island dialect. There's also an excellent YouTube video, Life on Tristan da Cunha, the world's most remote inhabited island, so check that out. But I said earlier that today I have a special item, and we get some background on it from Alan Crawford's book, Tristan da Cunha, Wartime Invasion. I'm going to quote from that book. The idea to publish a weekly newspaper first came to me in January 1942, before I even left Cape Town for Tristan to take part in the building of the military establishment there. It was not until the 6th of March 1943, almost a year after our arrival, that I was able to work up the enthusiasm required, and the naval officer in charge, Dr. Woolley, kindly offered to join the staff as foreign correspondent. That made the staff of 2, with me as editor and publisher. In order that the paper should have official status, it should be copyright and registered like all proper newspapers. It was necessary to put it onto a sound financial basis, otherwise it might be argued that it was nothing more than a circular or a magazine. But here the difficulty arose on account of the absence of any currency on the island, for the local population had never used any money, and the sailors bought goods at the naval canteen on the tick system. In the absence of money, how were we going to charge people for their weekly news? A Tristan's wealth is measured by the quantity of potatoes he possessed in his bins at the end of the digging season, and potatoes were often used locally for barter and exchange. It was therefore decided that the islanders should buy their papers in potatoes, and the sailors, well, every sailor carried one thing common almost to them all in his pocket. They would buy them with cigarettes. With the paper now placed on a financial basis, production proceeded, and on the 6th of March 1943, the first copy of the Tristan Times appeared on the island, their first newspaper. Every single day of the week for the next 30 weeks, Dr. Woolley listened in to the wireless in his office, to the BBC News broadcasts, and in a special diary for the purpose kept records of the weekly overseas news. Now let's break away there from quoting Crawford. He briefly goes on to explain how from Saturday morning until the early hours of Sunday morning, the Tristan Times would be compiled. He and his companion would have a news conference. The war news would then be placed in the left-hand column and the island news in the right-hand column of the pages, which were then ronioed on 2 machines. Returning to his account, it was decided that the newspaper was worth 3 cigarettes per copy for the naval personnel, and the first idea was that the islanders would buy theirs for 1 pound of potatoes a copy each week. The difficulty carrying a set of scales from house to house on which to measure the islanders' purchase price was soon obvious, and it was decided in those autumnal days of plenty that this idea should be replaced by 4 big potatoes a copy. This held and was well received locally for the first 3 weeks. As winter wore on, however, the value of this commodity rose as the islanders ate up their potatoes, and 4 big potatoes was soon replaced by 4 potatoes per copy. By the month of May, this price had to be further reduced to 3, and eventually, by the 7th of July, when some of the less industrious islanders had but few potatoes in their bins, the price reached the lowest figure of 2 potatoes per copy, at which it remained. The price to the sailors of 3 cigarettes did not alter. When after church the Tristan Times was ready for sale on Sunday mornings, 2 news vendors, Harold Green and Lindsay Repetto, each about 8 years of age, would come running up to the house where I lived for their 20 copies apiece. For the islanders usually purchased exactly 40 copies per week, which wasn't bad out of a total population of 52 families. With small gunny bags or sacks slung over their shoulders, off they would go from house to house to see who could finish first, the requisite number of potatoes being deposited into the sacks by each housewife. As payment for their work, Harold and Lindsay received sweets, lump sugar, and biscuits, which I was able to purchase from the naval canteen. So we'll leave Crawford there for a moment. So you'll have discerned that it was a very tiny print run. In 1943, a limited edition of Crawford's production was bound up, and he tells us more about that in another of his books, Tristan da Cunha and the Roaring Forties. He says, a number of complete runs of the paper were saved and bound, set number 2 being presented to the British Museum, and set number 3 to the Royal Geographical Society. Sets 4 and 8 went to the National Reference Library in Cape Town and the Afrikaner collection in Johannesburg, but the original manuscript copies are all I have kept myself. And I've said it's a special book that we have today because we have one of these complete bound-up runs of the paper, copy number 10, for Colonel Noel Parkin Selleck, appointed by Smuts to run the wartime meteorological services, the man who later became vice president of the World Meteorological Organization. It was he who sent Crawford to Tristan in the war years. But how special is this copy of the Tristan Times? Post-war issues of the Tristan Times occasionally appear on the market. We've already seen from Crawford's comments that a few repositories hold runs of the paper, but I've searched Biblio's auction and book sales archive and found 0 results for any of these Tristan Times books being offered at auction. Alan Crawford, in his own experience, comments on the value of the item in Tristan da Cunha and the Roaring Forties, and I quote him, "At a postal history auction in New York in March 1979, 25 copies of the original Tristan Times realized $4,250. I wish I had saved a few copies for myself," he says. But returning again to that question, how special is this book? Because rarity surely isn't the sole determinant of the value of an item printed. But a print run of 50 can be 50 copies too many in some cases if the item has no significance. So I think we need to turn our attention to the circumstances of the production of the Tristan Times and its distribution. This is the key to its importance. Consider that here an isolated and largely barely literate community, starved of news, was so eager for scraps from the battlefront and to see their own lives dignified by print, that they would sacrifice food for reading matter. Consider also that this newspaper was produced on the spot, the most unlikely spot. And I don't believe it's extravagant to say that it's reminiscent of Aurora Australis and the South Polar Times, published in Antarctica in the golden age of polar exploration, or perhaps even the Wipers Times printed in the trenches of the Western Front. Here we have a bound-up complete run from Crawford's term as editor, inscribed by the mastermind of the Tristan Times to the man who sent him to the loneliest island in the world. The Tristan Times goes on auction on the 6th of November in Antiquarian Auctions Sale number 127. It has a modest reserve price, and the sale runs until the 13th of November. If you've enjoyed this story behind a truly special and unusual printed item, please share it with a like-minded friend.